Okay, this week I have 3 video lectures that I want to present. One is about objectivity and diversity. I want to discuss another facet of that problem. The second one is about science and Pascal's wager. And the third one is about the so-called value-neutral ideal. So to begin with the first one, we are going to look at one of the most influential papers that has been published in the behavioral sciences in the last 10 years or so. It's an extremely famous paper and it's very interesting. And if you don't encounter it at any other point in your undergraduate education, I would be very surprised. And the title of the paper, as you can see, is a question. The weirdest people in the world? Who are the weirdest people in the world? Well, we'll find out. The abstract of this paper opens with this claim. Behavioral scientists are routinely publishing these papers where they make really broad, sweeping claims about human nature. And then the authors of this paper point out, most of this research is based exclusively on samples, that's groups of people, drawn from Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic countries. That is, weird societies. So that's what they mean by weird. Weird is an acronym for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic societies, like the ones that you're currently living in. And they go on to say, in fact, not only are the samples or the populations of people that are used in these studies, not only are they drawn from weird societies, but they're drawn from a very small segment of weird societies, undergraduates at research universities. So research universities are the most elite universities, and so the people who are being studied, who are standing in as representatives of human nature as such, are undergraduates who are at universities conducting this research. So why undergraduates at universities? Because that's who social scientists and behavioral scientists typically use when they need study participants. They give their students some kind of incentive to participate in the study. It's very convenient. You work at a university, sometimes there's 20, 30,000 people going to school there. You have access to this huge population of people that you can study and that you can easily get to join in on your studies because they live nearby and they're ready and willing to be participants. The problem is, does that radically skew our perspective of human nature? That's the question that the authors of this study are raising. Much of the research assumes that it doesn't. Much of the research assumes that these standard subjects are representative of our entire species. Are they? So the paper reviews this enormous comparative database, and they find that weird subjects, people from Western, educated, industrial, rich, democratic countries, weird subjects are in fact quite weird in the typical sense of the word weird. They are very unusual when compared to the rest of our species. So what you have in a lot of behavioral science is a subset, a very narrow, peculiar subset of the species, masquerading as an objective picture of human nature. And so that's what we were talking about last time. We had a certain perspective on being human that belonged to a particular scientific community which was quite homogeneous, that was then being imposed on the rest of humanity as a kind of norm. And what this research is showing is that there's a sense in which this is still happening. But it's not just because the research community is really homogeneous, which it still, unfortunately, is more homogeneous than it ought to be in an ideal world. But it's also that the populations that are being studied are extremely homogeneous in a problematic way. Okay, so let's really quickly consider one of the examples that they look at. So this is the so-called Mueller illusion. And for a long time, psychologists and cognitive scientists thought that this was a fundamental perceptual illusion that all human minds were subject to. So take a look at these two lines, line A and line B. Which one of them is longer? Now, if you're like most people from weird societies, and you in fact are yourself from a weird society, I don't want to take for granted that you are, but if you're like most folks from weird societies, you look at these two lines and you think that line B is longer. But if you took a ruler out and you measured them on your screen, you would see that the black lines are actually the exact same length. But there's something about the way the arrows, the direction in which the arrows are drawn, that throws our minds off if we're from a weird society. But here's another interesting fact about the findings. So at one end of the spectrum, you have American undergraduate students. And those students, on average, require line A to be about 20% longer than line B before they perceive the two as being about the same length. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, the San foragers of the Kalahari are completely unaffected by this so-called illusion. In fact, to them, it's not an illusion at all. They see the black lines and they say, yeah, they're exactly the same length. And then, like I said, it's a spectrum. Between the American undergraduates and the foragers of the Kalahari, you have a diverse array of responses to this so-called optical illusion. So what's the point? The point is that for a long time, cognitive scientists and psychologists thought this is a fundamental perceptual illusion that we're all subject to in virtue of having the kind of mind that we have. And what this finding suggests is that that's not true at all, that this is actually a kind of cultural byproduct. Okay, so why does this happen to us? So if you're from a weird society, why is it that these two lines, even though they're exactly the same length, they look to be a different length? Well, the theory is sometimes referred to as the theory about the Carpentered World. And the idea is, if you grow up in a weird society, you grow up in buildings that have carpentered corners. And if you'll notice, this line here, the one that appears shorter to us, it looks like this line, right? You see how the lines go down there? And then this line here, which appears longer to us, it's shaped like this line, right? So the line of the carpentered corner, when it's further away from us, the lines go up from it. And when it's closer to us, the lines go down on the side. And so the idea here is your mind knows that this wall here is the exact same length, the exact same height as this wall here. But this wall is closer to you, and that's why it appears longer. So when your mind sees these lines, even though they're exactly the same length, your mind assumes that this one is longer because this one would be the one that was down here in the hall, far away from you. And if it's the same length as this one, you know that it's actually much longer because, right, the distance it is away from you would make it appear shorter. Okay, I'm still not happy with that explanation, so let's try it one more time. So if you look at these shapes, this shape corresponds to this shape. So if you're standing in a hallway, this would represent the wall that's nearer to you, and this shape corresponds to this one. So that corresponds to the shape of a wall that's further away from you. So your brain knows when it sees this shape, that's the one nearer to you, and when it sees this shape, that's the wall that's further away from you. When you stand in a hallway, because this wall is far away, it looks shorter. Things that are further away look smaller. Things that are closer to you appear bigger. So, your brain knows that this wall down here is just as tall as this wall right here, but it appears shorter because it's far away from you. So, because your brain knows that relationship, when it sees this shape, and it knows that this mirrors the shape of something that's far away from you, your brain makes a kind of inference. Well, this one must be longer because sure, it looks like it's about the same length as this one, but it's got that shape of something that's far away from you. And you know that things that are far away from you appear smaller than they actually are. So the idea is that your brain looks at these two lines, and even though they're the exact same length, it automatically makes a correction for depth because your brain is used to seeing carpentered corners. It knows that this shape means that the line is actually longer than it appears. So when it sees this shape, it automatically makes the inference that this line is in fact longer than this one. So the Mueller-Lyer illusion on this account is a kind of culturally evolved byproduct. It's not a core constitutive feature of human perception in general. It's something that we pick up in the course of our normal development. Here's another example. This is the Ebbinghaus illusion. So take a look at the two orange circles, the two orange spheres. Which one is bigger? If you're like most weird people, you're going to say that the orange circle on the right appears bigger. You might know that it's the same size, but it appears bigger. And the truth of the matter is that the orange spheres are exactly the same size. The one on the right just appears bigger because it's encircled by smaller circles, whereas the one on the left appears smaller because it's encircled by those very large circles. So here's the thing. When weird people look at this, they see it as an illusion. They get it wrong. But when people from remote villages look at these images, they get it right. They look at them and they say, oh yeah, the orange circles are exactly the same size. And the hypothesis that explains this is that people from remote villages rely less on the holistic context when they're assessing things. So the encircling circles don't affect their judgment as much as the circles affect judgments of people from weird societies. And the basic idea behind this hypothesis is that people in weird societies are constantly assessing things across different types of contexts. And because we're so used to doing it, it leads to illusions in certain cases. Whereas people in remote villages, they're not exposed to that type of comparative activity as much. And so they don't have the same kind of tendency to really be taken in by the holistic context in which the things are presented to them. Okay, so what's the point of all of this? Well, the idea is we can't draw conclusions about human nature by studying undergrads at research universities. That's the simplistic claim, and it's a pretty powerful argument that's made for it in this paper. But the sort of more philosophically significant claim that I wanted to run by you is this idea that to achieve objectivity, to think of objectivity as a social achievement, we not only need to diversify our research communities for the reasons that we talked about last week, but we also need to study diverse populations. Because even if the research community is extremely diverse, if we don't make an effort to study diverse populations, we will still get a skewed picture of humanity, and what we think is an objective account of human nature will be a really distorted one, maybe even a weird one. Okay, so if you're interested in this kind of research, Henrik, his paper was so famous, he actually wrote a popular book about this research. It's a really fun read. I recommend it if you're interested in this kind of thing. And now we should take a break.